Welcome to Counterpunch Radio. I am your program producer, Nathaniel St. Clair, and this is an excellent episode. Erik and Joshua have a rousing conversation with Eman Abdelhadi and Khury Petersen-Smith about the Palestine solidarity movement and strategies moving forward. But before we get to that, I want to give you a quick look at the paid portion of our website and remind you that becoming a Counterpunch Plus member is the best way to support our publication. What you'll find there is not bonus content. This isn't fluff. It is first-rate, hard-hitting investigative journalism. For example, this exceptional piece by William Silversmith titled "Hunted by Israeli Tanks and Drones, an English Teacher Protects Her Family in Central Gaza." Here's an excerpt. When the Israeli tanks finished their operation, Kamla left the tent she had evacuated to. She went to see if her house was still standing. She found it partially destroyed. Yet she still tried to clear the rubble to live in it once more. That was not the end, however, as Israel returned with more tanks and bombs. Each time it happened, Kamla and her family would run for safety to the local school, and when the weapons quieted, they would return to their house to assess the damage. This happened several times in 1 week. Thus began Kamla's personal experience of being displaced by the U.S.-backed Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza. End quote. That is just one of many powerful stories you will have access to as a member of CP+, which is only $5 a month. And since we are a purely reader-powered publication, that consistent support is legitimately what keeps us keeping on. But if you don't have the means to become a member, you can also support us by simply sharing this podcast and maybe writing a quick review on whatever service you use to listen. Anyway, let's get to what you came here for. Our interview with Eman Abdelhadi and Khury Petersen-Smith.
Welcome to Counterpunch Radio. I'm Erik Wallenberg, joined by my co-host Joshua Frank. We're excited today to bring you two voices from the Palestine solidarity movement. We're hosting this conversation as we near the one-year anniversary of October 7th, and as activists and organizers on college campuses and in cities and communities across the US grapple with next steps in the struggle to stop the ongoing genocide in Palestine. We're thrilled to welcome Eman Abdelhadi, an academic, activist, and writer who thinks at the intersection of gender, sexuality, religion, and politics. She's an assistant professor and sociologist at the University of Chicago, where she researches American Muslim communities. She's the author of Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072. She's also a columnist for In These Times, where you can follow her latest. She organizes with faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine and Salon Kawakib. Khury Petersen-Smith is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow and co-director of the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. He researches the US empire, borders, and migration. His work has appeared widely, including in Truthout, In These Times, and Foreign Policy in Focus. He's one of the co-authors and organizers of the 2023 Black Voices for Ceasefire statement, which was signed by over 6,000 Black activists, artists, and scholars. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're so excited that you're with us today. Let's just jump right in. As Erik mentioned, we're coming up on the one-year anniversary of October 7th, so I think it's a good place to start. Eman, yeah, in an interview with American Prospect last May, you wrote or said, "I think you could hold both that there were atrocities committed on October 7th and people who were killed shouldn't have been killed. And the fact that there was, as Judith Butler called it, an uprising in a sense. We need to think about the root cause of this violence." October 7th, at least in the mainstream media, is never referred to as an uprising, right? And we still hear a lot of lies about the events of October 7th, including the debunked rape allegations with Kamala Harris repeated during the presidential debate last week. So my question is, how does this framing of October 7th continue to be used to justify Israel's genocide in Gaza? And how can we best respond to this, especially as we're coming up on the anniversary, and we're sure to see and hear an all-out media blitz by Israel and their mouthpieces here in the U.S. So how do we respond to this?
Well, for one, we need to understand the falsehoods, like you said, that are mentioned about October 7th. So often, the number of folks killed is cited at 1,200, but many reports have shown since then that many of that 1,200 was killed actually by the Israeli army. So that's been a documented fact. There's also never a distinction between civilian deaths and soldier and police deaths, which is something that is important in the context of conflict and war. It's been clear to analysts that the militants on October 7th were targeting primarily military targets and police targets and border targets. Now, as I said in that interview that you cited, we can still hold that, innocent people who should not have been killed were killed. But I think that more important than the events, than litigating the kind of details of the events of the day, is understanding why October 7th happened, rejecting the narrative that history started on October 7th. The reality is that Palestinians were held under siege in Gaza in an open-air prison for 17 years. Even their calories were counted and controlled by the state of Israel. They had shortages of food, water, infrastructure, and had no right to self-determination or autonomy. And under those conditions, it's simply a matter of time that people are going to revolt, that people are going to say, we're going to cross these borders. Now, the population of folks in Gaza is already and mostly a refugee population of folks internally displaced by Israeli occupation and the Israeli military regime. So, part of what we've been seeing over the last year is an intensification of the narrative war that Israel has led really for almost 100 years now, right? Even before its founding, the Zionist movement was in a narrative war. And the latest battle in this war is, when does history start? Right? And we have to assert that history starts much earlier than October 7th, even earlier than the siege of Gaza, all the way back to the sort of Zionist terrorist groups that displaced Palestinians in the 30s and the 40s, all the way up to the Nakba. So I think that's a really important reframing that we need to push on.
And Khury, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I know that over the past 2 decades, you've been to Iraq and Palestine with anti-war delegations and Black solidarity organizers, and through the work you do exposing U.S. military practices, the policies and practices that have led to countless atrocities committed by the U.S. I was hoping that you might start by saying that it's certainly not the same as what's happening in Gaza, but if you could talk about this special relationship, the so-called special relationship that the U.S. has with Israel, and how much the two work hand in glove to militarily dominate the Middle East.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because, when Eman raises this question of when does history start, and whose histories are we considering? One of the things that has been left out in a way that's so unacceptable are all the prehistories that I think inform this moment and inform Israeli violence, in Palestine and in Gaza in particular, inform the U.S. support of that violence. And that includes not only histories in that particular place in Palestine, but recent histories of the U.S. activity throughout the region, for the past, but let's just say the past 2 decades. We could go further back, but actually the Israeli officials put this on the table. When confronted for the mass bombardment that they're carrying out in Gaza, Israeli officials say, all we're doing is what the U.S. did in Mosul and in Raqqa. And that's true. We have where I live in Massachusetts, there's a member of Congress, Seth Moulton, who is a Marine Corps veteran. He wrote a piece in Time magazine last fall in which he offered Israeli forces advice on how to carry out this offensive in Gaza. And he said he offered for consideration what he did personally in Fallujah in Iraq. He talks about how they systematically depopulated the city of civilians so that they could fight, who they call the bad guys. And he was offering this as a kind of suggestion, forced displacement of a city's population. The fact that a sitting member of Congress can write this in Time magazine, and that the Israelis consider it. I mean, it frankly has that has characterized a lot of the Israeli approach. In the name of quote unquote protecting civilians, they say in their words that they're evacuating zones, which is in fact forced displacement. This is what the US has done and has normalized for 2 decades in front of the eyes of the world, as the US has done with torture at Guantanamo Bay, at CIA black sites, and elsewhere, in Abu Ghraib prison, that we're now seeing Israeli torture of Palestinians in Gaza and folks detained and brought across the border. So this US-Israel relationship is one not only where the US seems to support Israeli violence with no conditions at all. I mean, that's part of the evidence of the past year. But also the US is really modeling for Israel how to carry out its violence and how to get away with it. And there was a saying among some Iraqi folks when the US invaded Iraq in 2003 and overthrew Saddam Hussein's government. There was a saying that was the students out, now the teachers here, that is referring to, obviously Saddam Hussein, ruled Iraq in a horrific way. But he himself was on the US payroll. He was armed with US weapons. And the US has really acted as this instructor for how to carry out violence to various allies around the world, and in particular Israel, for many decades. And I think that we're seeing that in a really brutal way at the moment in Palestine.
Yeah, and this history, as you said, we could talk about a much longer history. But I think just even going back to the recent past, of course, I think of the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then all of the attendant sort of Islamophobia and racism that has come to the fore in this country. But I don't want to spend too much time thinking just about their side, but also thinking about how we've responded and how the left's responded and how people who are fighting these wars have responded. So I think a lot of people have been talking about the fight to end apartheid in South Africa and sort of how both violent and nonviolent, the different tactics over a long period of time that were used in that struggle. And of course, the struggle for a free Palestine that's had a long and varied history as well. And certainly, like I said, we can't cover all that right now. But I was hoping that you might say something of the work you did when you went to Palestine and the Black solidarity with Palestine work. And the connections forged really since the Ferguson uprising, in that certainly Ferguson and how Black Lives Matter has changed the conversation in so many ways, not just about racism in this country, anti-Black racism, but a bigger question, and about US foreign policy, but also those wars that really have shaped this entire century now. And Eman, I'm sure you'll have things to add on that too, and from your work. So, but yeah, maybe we can start with you, Khury.
Yeah, well, I want to start by shouting out somebody named Kwambi Samburu, who's now an ancestor, but was a longtime activist and movement elder who lived here in Boston. And I met him at a rally. I think it was against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. And he showed me, he was carrying around with him a copy of a statement that was published against against Israeli violence and Zionism by Black Americans that was published in the New York Times in 1970. And that statement, it introduced me to this incredibly rich history of solidarity between Black folks, in particular, Black Americans and Palestine and Palestinian freedom struggle. And that statement informed a statement that a bunch of us put out in 2015 after the summer of 2014, which was the summer when we saw simultaneously the Ferguson uprising, which came after the police murder of Mike Brown, and also not long after the police murder in New York City of Eric Garner. This was an uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, that coincided with the 2014 Israeli bombardment of Gaza, and those two events were put in conversation in a massive way, and the organic connections that related them were also revealed to so many people. The fact that the police forces that were repressing Black folks in Ferguson, St. Louis police in particular, train in Israel, as do every major police force in this country and a lot of small police forces as well. The fact that the St. Louis police were using weapons like the skunk truck that was piloted against Palestinians by Israeli forces. But then also a kind of callback and a reiteration, a new iteration of solidarity between these freedom struggles. And so you had Palestinians take to social media offering Black folks advice about how to deal with tear gas in that moment. You had not one but two statements of solidarity from Palestine with the Ferguson uprising and the Black freedom struggle in the US. And so we put out a statement in 2015 in solidarity with the Palestinian freedom struggle. And that was the origins of this project called Black for Palestine that I'm part of. So that history is vast, it's rich, and I think that we've been in this new chapter of Black Palestine solidarity for a little while, and there's so much to say about it. But one thing to say is that right now, the wave of protest that we are experiencing in the face of this horrific genocidal violence, we do have this historic, just protest wave that won't stop. It's been going for nearly a year. We've never had anything like this for Palestine in the history of this country. It is one of the great moments of people in this country challenging U.S. foreign policy. And it is also the largest uprising in this country since the 2020 uprisings, the 2020 Black-led uprisings. And I actually don't think it's coincidental that the two largest uprisings in recent memory are like 2020 uprisings against anti-Black racism, and then this sustained protest wave against U.S. support for Israeli violence. And it's not just the kind of, the power, the impact of those uprisings, but with that power, the conclusions that people are drawing are so deep. Like, so many people in this country went through the year 2020 transformed. People who maybe had thought about racism as a bad thing, but really had not seen how it operates. Got an education, when they went into the streets, demanding justice for people murdered, for Breonna Taylor and George Floyd murdered, and faced tear gas, faced the National Guard deployment, etc. It forced, among other things, finally, a more honest conversation about slavery and the kind of anti-Black racism at the foundation of this country than we've had in a very long time. And I think in a similar way, the uprising that's happening right now, it's forcing people to raise deep questions, about what the U.S. does around the world and why it does these things. And that, I think, is really at the heart of Black Palestine solidarity, is both the Black freedom struggle and the Palestinian freedom struggle do so much to reveal the violent order of the world, and also, I think, point people in a direction that forces a reimagining of the world. And that, I think, is why those connections and intersections historically and today have been so powerful.
That's great. I guess this is a good segue to talk about the college campus movement against the genocide in Gaza. Eman, let's shift to that. Last week, I covered a situation where I live here in California at Cal State Long Beach, where 5 professors are currently being reprimanded in retaliation for writing a piece about the school's connections to Boeing and Boeing's connections to the genocide in Gaza. The piece appeared in Counterpunch and also Mondo Weiss. But this is just one example of how university administrators across the country are attempting to squelch free speech and dissuade activism on campus. Of course, there's similar tactics being used at Columbia, NYU, all over the place. It's not unique to Cal State Long Beach. But in spite of these crackdowns, there are still victories happening. Like San Francisco State recently agreed to divest. There's lots of other examples of this sort of successes happening despite this crackdown. So my question is, how do you think about the movement right now where it is? And how do you think that we ought to respond to these efforts to curtail college protest as the fall semester unfolds?
Yeah, I think, it's important to recognize the importance of student activism. I think the reason, the reaction, the intensity of the censorship, the intensity of the crackdowns, the sending in of the police, the brutalizing students, they're all reflections of how threatening power finds student activism, right? That student activism has often been part of the turning point in American history of various social movements, right? Founders of the Black Panthers met on a college campus, on a community college campus. So it's really, I think that we have to recognize these efforts as a metric of how powerful this movement could be. I think that I think we need to keep going. I think they're relying on the idea that we might be burnt out, that we might be tired. But I think we also have to adjust our strategies to the moment, including the idea that we may not have the same kind of street mobilizations that we had, across the fall and the early spring. So I think, our tactics need to evolve with, our tactics and our strategies need to evolve with the situation at hand. I think that we need to be fighting these repressive tactics by administrations on every front, right? I think we should be fighting them legally. I think we should be fighting them by defying them, by simply making them impossible to enforce, and by continuing to kind of pressure these institutions from within. I think that, and I think this speaks to where the movement is in general, there needs to be an effort towards moving from mobilizing to organizing, right? We've been able to mobilize, like Khury said, millions of people on the street. And the question is, where are those people now, right? Are they still active? Have we been able to plug them into long-term fights, whether that's in their workplaces, their schools, their local elections, their, whatever the realm is, right? Boycotts. Have we been able to kind of move towards organizing those folks? And I think that's a question both on campuses and off campus, right? And I think that that's where our energy needs to go right now, is creating, severing these ties with Israeli institutions, one institution at a time. I think there's this sense we've been acting under the intense urgency of this moment, right? And this kind of desire to have this one solution that supersedes them all. If we just stay in the streets, it's all going to be over. But I think what we've learned is that we have to exert pressure on every single social and political and economic institution in this society, and exert that pressure in concerted ways and systematically, such that these ties these ties with Israel, these ties that maintain Israel's ability to dominate Palestinians, that these ties break, right? One by one, company by company, school by school, institution, business by business. I think, so in a sense, what I'm advocating for is a ground up approach, because that's where our power is. We saw that our power is not with electeds, right? But and our power is not with the really big corporations. Our power is with the streets, and we know that we can create a groundswell, to push influence up to the front. But we need to stop trying to target just, to try to basically target the top, right? I think that this kind of everything that's happened with these elections, these presidential elections, have really driven that point home for me. And I want to be clear that when Biden stepped down, which I still see as a movement win, the fact that he was forced down in part by like a tanking of his ratings by this uprising. I think it was worthwhile to push the Harris campaign as it was still forming. I think that was a worthwhile effort, but I think we've also seen the limits of it. That she has doubled down. She has decided to recruit from the right. She has decided that independents are more important than progressives. And in fact, Republicans are more important than progressives. And so the question becomes, how do we make it impossible for her to continue to hold that position? How do we make it materially impossible to hold that position? And so for me, it's about putting pressure from the ground up. And the hard news is that that's slow work. That's slow work. It takes power mapping. It takes, building these relationships. But I think that we have a ton of momentum, and we need to ride that momentum into creating these grassroots coalitions and organizations, or building out these grassroots coalitions and organizations that can do this kind of work. It is frustrating. It's frustrating, like in the face of people literally being slaughtered every day, that we're in this position. But I hope that it is that the fact of the frustration of this moment should feed our radicalism, right? Should feed our reflection that this is a fucked up system, right? A system in which the majority of the American people saying, stop using our money to kill children, and saying that in the street, saying that in opinion polls after opinion poll, and that not mattering, not having any material impact on US foreign policy, that's a lesson that I hope we never forget. And I think it's our role in the movement to keep reminding people that that's in fact the system that we live in. But recognizing how corrupt and frustrating the system is not an excuse not to organize and not to try to do the work. And so I think we have this fine line we have to walk, where we have to look for wins and pursue them doggedly, right? While recognizing that the system is set up for us to fail. But that's not an excuse not to try, right?
I wonder if just on that, you might say just a word too about University of Chicago, because there was a bit of a victory, to my understanding, after students were targeted this past spring with threats of not being able to graduate, that in fact they were vindicated in that front. So even those small victories, I think it was at Rutgers where they won, it feels minuscule in a moment like this, but where they won, I think, full scholarships for maybe 10 students to come from Gaza who no longer have a university to attend because they've all been destroyed by US bombs and the Israeli military. And it feels tiny, but it also feels like the kind of place where you can start to see ways to build or victories that can give people a little bit more to go on. And I don't know if maybe you both might say something about some of those victories.
Well, here at UChicago, they held the degrees of 11 students, and over the summer. They had served many students with disciplinary hearings, both for a building occupation that happened in late November. The admin served all of these students with disciplinary hearings that weren't processed until May. And if you have a disciplinary hearing that's open, it means that if you have other so-called infractions, then you're at a higher risk. These are literally police tactics. We know these tactics because the police do this all the time, right? Where you get arrested. Like we had protesters in April here in Chicago get arrested in a blockade near O'Hare. Those protesters kept having their court hearings pushed and pushed and pushed until, lo and behold, after the DNC. Shocking that these folks would, now why would you want to do that, right? These are deactivating techniques. They're techniques to say, we're putting you on notice, we're going to increase the risk of action, and therefore keep you at home, right? And then they eventually, in the kind of quiet of summer, after a lot of pressure, they released these 11 degrees for these students to graduate. We have to recognize that all of this is a scare tactic, right? All of this is about setting up a cost to participating. And the way that we counteract that, right, is by having more and more people do it so that there's a counter cost to them of having to do this, right? Making it kind of impossible to impose this cost effectively because of the cost that we impose in terms of pressure and participation. So I think so yes, I think those degrees being released is a win, but the bigger win is that, faculty and staff here are organized. I mean, we have 200 people organized in faculty and staff for justice in Palestine when we had nothing in the fall. I mean, this is literally a year's worth of organization. We are represented in every unit of this university and pretty much almost every position that you can think of. And we now have a political home, right? Many of us are not unionized. We otherwise don't have a political home with each other and in this workplace. So the win, right, is what we can do next. And that's the question that I think we should all be asking ourselves is what can we do next, right? How do we create these spaces? And yes, I think that wins from the encampments that bring more space to talk about Palestine. Our students had negotiated for 8 scholars at risk positions, which are positions the university offers people, scholars that are in conflict zones, right? They negotiated 8 of those specifically for Gazan scholars. We have our first one coming in the fall. So this is someone who's coming in from Palestine, who's going to be here on campus. It is minuscule. It is not the end of our aspirations, but it is, him being here is going to create even more space to talk about Palestine, even more space to mobilize, even more space to tell the stories that the university is trying to invisibilize. So we need to all be asking ourselves, what are those wins, right? What are those spaces that we can create in our spheres of influence?
Khury, I think let's circle back to the election for a second. I'm curious how you think about the anti-genocide movement right now in relation to electoral politics. We've touched on it a little bit. In this total election circle of madness that we're in the middle of right now. How are you thinking about all of this from a strategic organizing point of view right now?
Yeah, great question. Well, first, I just have to say, before getting to that, I must say that the choice in quotes that were being offered between somebody who is part of an administration that is actively, enthusiastically carrying out a genocide and then an open fascist really is such an indictment of the whole of, kind of US official politics. Alongside what Eman said about the fact that clear majorities of people in this country not only want a ceasefire, but are calling for an end to US weapons to Israel, and yet the policy has been the opposite. It's been advancing more weapons to Israel. So I just have to, I have to start there. But in terms of thinking about it strategically, I couldn't agree more with what Eman said. I think that the efforts to say, where activists said, okay, the election is this is an election year, and that is complicated to say the least, but among other things, there is at least the kind of, the parties are required to, in some way, appear to be responsive to the electorate. Is there a possibility there to explore strategically? And I think that activists have done that, pursued that, and I supported those efforts, to intervene at the DNC, and I think the results are in. Like the Harris campaign has made a calculation that, obviously they don't care about Palestinian lives. That was evident, from jump. But they've also made a calculation that those of us who do, that they can get along without those of us who are digging in on this question, and so I think that what I mostly think is that we need to pursue other sites of power, which is always a challenge in the United States, always a challenge in an election year, especially in this one. And I am sympathetic to those who are horrified by the possibility of a Trump presidency. I am too. And it's just so clear that on the question that has been put forward as kind of the key question, this year, at least and especially for, the most politically engaged people in the country, young people who are in these streets, working to stop U.S. support for Israeli genocide. This election is not, it's not a context for us to redress that, right? The other thing is that it's not just that the question of ending U.S. support for the genocide is not on the ballot. It's also that the election, I think that, this is always true when it comes to social movements, but I think especially this year, the people who run this country are using the election to actually redirect political energy and distract away from the movement to fight to end this genocide. And there's so much to say about that, but one thing is just the way that this election operates and the way that it, the kind of order of the official proceedings is that we're supposed to vote in November for a president who's going to take office in late January. The genocide is happening today. So I'm actually very concerned about the kind of gravitational pull and the very active argument for people to focus on this election and in a way that takes away from what are we doing today to stop this genocide? And I think that's the question. I think that it's like acknowledging, it's not about ignoring the election. We can't ignore it. It's a reality. But I think we actually have to redirect and say every day in Gaza is long. Between now and November, in election day, is impossibly long. Between now and when the next president takes office in January is impossibly long. And so we actually can't accept we either the fact that, again, this question is not on the ballot, nor can we accept the timeline of this election. And I think that instead we actually have to direct our own timeline and call attention to the urgency of the genocide right now.
I think this feels like the giant contradiction of our moment and the real difficulty of this moment, that we have an ongoing genocide, and it feels like everything we do and every minute we spend our day feels like a waste, or it doesn't feel like enough, or it feels like we should be doing something else, and it's a constant questioning. And so I take Eman's comment about, we need to move from sort of just like individual actions to long-term organizing and the importance of that. because this isn't going away, and the U.S. special relationship with Israel isn't going away, and the crisis in the West Bank isn't going away, and on and on and on. So like holding both of those things, I think, is difficult for people. And you have a set of people who think they can just vote on in the November elections, and that will maybe solve the problem, or will make them, like, it's the only thing they think they can do. And so I think part of and we've talked about the college campuses, and there is some like sense of what to organize there, but I do think there's a problem for the rest of people that aren't on college campuses too, of what to do. And there's been inspiring actions. Jewish Voice for Peace has hosted amazing actions, very high visible actions. The Palestinian Feminist Collective and the youth movement have done amazing work. And on. People have, I think about the state of the genocide, where you spoke and a group of people got arrested, shutting down the street outside the federal building, like just desperate kind of attempts to draw attention and think of what we can do. So I just wonder maybe if we could close with any other thoughts on what we do, how we organize. The BDS movement has been stymied time and again, but comes back, right? It's still very active. I think of the weapons manufacturers as like a central target, which feels like we haven't had enough traction around trying to shut down those locations in the US. So just curious if you might give us some final words on sort of targets and actions and things people can do in a moment like this, that doesn't feel like, okay, I'm just arguing with people that voting isn't gonna solve the problem, which, which we know, but but what to do.
Yeah, I think these examples that you gave, Erik, are really good. For me, it's about thinking, okay, what am I close enough to that I can influence, right? So I think, what is my sphere of influence is one thing that folks could be asking themselves, right? Where does that sphere of influence have relationships with the state of Israel, or where are the relationships in that sphere of influence? Do I live by a weapons manufacturer, right? That I can, that like folks could blockade or some kind of action. Is it that I live in a state that has an anti-BDS law, and can I organize around that? And who's organizing around that? Should I join them? Can I organize my workplace, right? Can I make sure that my workplace is not invested in or is not complicit in Israeli in the Israeli military, or in general, is BDS compliant? Is boycotting, divesting from, sanctioning the state of Israel? So I think, or like who in my, or are there organizers around me that I can take care of, right? If that's not your thing, that, like what reproductive labor could you sort of provide? And that's an important part of our movements as well. But this question of what am I uniquely posed to do, and what is my sphere of influence, and then where are the ties? I think ultimately we have to make investing in Israel costly. We have to make it a toxic asset. And I think that's where we've had our biggest wins, right? We've had Intel pull out of Israel, and it was a huge loss for them. They are suffering economically because of this. It's also becoming socially unacceptable, right? You have people in the streets being like, oh, I don't want to like associate with that, right? I don't want to be seen around that. It's gonna cause controversy, or it's gonna bring me critique. I think we have to sort of create this environment where this is a toxic asset. Like, until something changes, right? We're not here for people having relationships with the state of Israel. Every institution should know that every relationship with Israel is going to be examined. It is going to be the subject of activism. It is going to be the subject of disruption. So yeah, and I think the sky is the limit, and we have so much potential right now, and we will free Palestine. Well, Palestine will free itself, but we will help.
Khury, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you so much for that response and for this question. And so a few things. One is, I think it's important just to have some perspective on what we're up against. That feels extremely, that just feels really important. And I'll just say, I have a piece of paper above my desk where I had listed the number of days of previous bombardments, Israeli bombardments of Gaza, 08, 09, 2014, 2021, 2012, and these bombardments lasted days, maybe weeks. And then I had a tally of the days that this was lasting. I started this last fall. And there's a point where I was like looking at all these tally marks, after weeks, and I was like, okay, this is something different. This is not like the other one. I mean, as horrific beyond words as those were, this is something different. And it forced an adjustment. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't make the work any less urgent. It actually, for me, it puts a premium on being more strategic. So that's sobering, but feels like important to have that kind of orientation. But the other part of the orientation, so when I started that tally sheet last fall, if you had told me that right now in September 2024, the majority of Americans would be for stopping U.S. weapons to Israel. I mean, 75% of Black people say the U.S. should not be sending weapons to Israel. It's offering our side some opportunities and some responsibilities that we've never had before. And I think actually that itself has been overwhelming. I think we've never been in a like this sort of fighting, doing our part, you know what I mean, to support the Palestinian freedom struggle, to stop Israeli violence. We've never been in a situation where the majority of Americans are cutting with us. And it's kind of hard to know what to do with opportunity and power. We have power for the first time. I think that we've been learning how to use it. You know what I mean? And that's what Eman is speaking to. And we have a responsibility to figure that out. So with that, I think strategically, I think we have to do a couple things. And this is absolutely aligned with everything that Eman just said, in my opinion. I think we have to do a couple things, and it feels like those things are kind of in tension with each other. But I think that we can figure out the balance. On one hand, I think that we actually need to be more disruptive in terms of the actual processes that are sustaining this genocide, because we have intervened so forcefully and so impactfully in the kind of political realm. I mean, we have forced this as a national conversation for almost a year now. We have passed city council resolutions in cities all across this country. We have made this an issue on every college campus in this country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, as we're doing those things, below the surface, there is this machinery that is warring away, that is manufacturing these weapons, that is transporting them, et cetera. I think that we have to figure out how to disrupt that machinery, how to take this power that we've built in the political realm and direct it toward the actual machinery that enables genocide in the ways that Eman was talking about. What's happening in my city in terms of manufacturing? What's happening in my city in terms of transport? I live in Boston. I live in a port city. Okay, the U.S. is supplying weapons. It is supplying jet fuel to the state of Israel. Those boats carrying jet fuel that leave from Corpus Christi, Texas, do they dock in Boston on the way? If so, what's our responsibility here, in this city? We know that Zim, the Israeli shipping company, whose CEO said, our first priority is the state of Israel, and we are at your service, right? So we know that Zim is shipping weapons. We know they dock in Boston. So what is our responsibility, right? But here's the other thing. Here's the trick. We have to be disruptive while, I think, preserving and expanding the broad mass character that has characterized the past 11 months of struggle, because that's actually what's different now. It's actually our movement has done direct action targeting weapons manufacturers before last October. What's unique is now there's countless rallies and protests and marches all across this country. Now you have the majority of Americans are with us, right? And so it's how do we maintain that level of invitation while stepping up, the level of disruption, which is doing the work of what Eman said. It's actually raising the cost. You know what I mean? They have made a calculation. They're not fools in Washington. They are aware of how devastating this is in Gaza. They've decided that they can pull it off, and we have to make it too expensive for them, too expensive politically, and too difficult to carry out. And I think that requires, taking a look in our communities, on our campuses, to think about where we fit in this machinery, and then how we can mobilize and organize to do our part to stop it.
That's fantastic. And thank you so much for your time today. We hope to have you both back on the show as this all unfolds this fall. You have such important words of inspiration and also tactical things that we can do and to organize. And it was such a great conversation. Thanks so much for being with us today on Counterpunch Radio.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for being here, Al.
Yeah, thank you.
Wait. Before you go, it's me, Nathaniel, back in your ears. What a great interview, right? Well, guess what? We have some extra audio for you that will close this episode on an exhilarating note. Here is a speech that Eman gave at the Bodies Outside of Unjust Laws demonstration on August 18th in Chicago, outside of the DNC. Enjoy.
Chicago, look at us! What we here for? Free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
Chicago, we all know why we're here. We're drowning and our hearts are broken. We are drowning in debt, in medical bills, in rising rents, in inflation. We are under attack in this country. The right has declared war on people of color, on trans people, on women. They are trying to dismantle our systems of education, trying to criminalize teaching Black history and the realities of racism, oppression, and exploitation in this country. Shame indeed. They openly call for mass deportations and want to strip Black people of voter rights. Every year, the climate crisis kills more people of heat, of floods, of fires. Every year, the number of climate refugees at home and abroad climbs and climbs. And in this moment of absolute disaster, of crisis, the American ruling class, the people descending on this city for the Democratic National Convention tomorrow, have seen fit to spend our money, my money, your money, on killing children in Gaza. They've provided an infinite supply of bombs to destroy Gaza's homes, its schools, its hospitals, its playgrounds, its mosques, its churches, its croplands, and its infrastructure. At the head of the most powerful country on earth, they have bullied the rest of the world in the name of protecting a far-right government openly committing a genocide. And now they want our votes. They say they've earned them by showing a little more empathy towards poor Palestinians they happen to kill. Vice President Harris, we hear your shift in tone, but I'm here to tell you, your tone will not resurrect the dead. Your tone will not shelter the living. Your tone will not pull bombs out of the sky. Your tone is not enough. Genocide Joe would still be on the ticket if it were not for this movement. For all of us. Our movement is one of the main reasons that you are now the Democratic candidate for president in the most powerful country on the planet. You, Vice President Harris, get to run for office because we ousted your predecessor right here in these streets. And it was never just about him. It was about the 40,000 Palestinians he helped kill. And now you are telling us that not the other guy is a platform. We are telling you that you have to actually earn our votes. And we are telling you exactly how to earn them. We are telling you we want a weapons embargo. We are telling you we want a permanent ceasefire. And we are telling you that we want them now. That democracy itself is on the line. You keep telling us that fascism is knocking at the door. You keep telling us that Trump would be worse. But the majority of Americans, in poll after poll, say they disapprove of Israel's actions in Gaza. Study after study shows that a weapons embargo would earn you more votes, would secure you this election. So, Vice President, why are you risking the end of democracy, the rise of fascism, the return of Trump to protect Netanyahu's war on children? You are not the protector of democracy. We are the protectors of democracy. If you want to see democracy, look to Chicago's streets this week. Democracy speaking back to power, saying we will not be ignored. We want to house our unhoused. We want to feed our hungry. We want to heal our sick. We want to guard our planet. We want to build our future, not walk as children of theirs. That the people of the United Senate today are the ones who get to shape the future of this country. That is not true. We make the future of this country. We make it where we've always made it. We make it right here on the streets. Vice President, you have a choice. You could join a movement for justice. You could make a place for yourself in history. You could be a leader who chose to listen to her people rather than the interests of the war manufacturers. Or you could become a war criminal. Ms. Harris, if you want Donald Trump to win, then say that. Otherwise, we are speaking!